أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما نافعا اللهم أرنا الحق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه وأرنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to the Reflections on the Risale-i Nur by Bediuzzaman Said Nursi podcast series. This is Mustafa Tuna. You can listen to the episodes of this series wherever you listen to your podcasts or at the website www.reflections-rn.org. A rough translation of the text we will be studying is also posted at this website. You can go to podcasts, then words, then the 12th word, and scroll down to the relevant episode, inshallah. So we are continuing with the 12th word. And as Ustad Nursi introduced at the beginning of that word, this treatise comprises a concise comparison of the sacred wisdom of the Wisdomful Qur'an and the wisdom of philosophy, a brief summary of the lesson that it delivers to organize the personal and social lives of human beings, and an indication of the Qur'an's preponderance over other divine words and all speeches. So we covered the first and second of the four sections that this treatise is made up of. The first one was a comparison of the wisdom of the Quran and the wisdom of, let's say, materialist science. The second one was a comparison of the Quran's lesson, the wisdoms that the Quran offers in relation to a human being's personal life, with the wisdoms, the lessons that what Ustad Nursi identified as European philosophy, or we may also call Western philosophy. But we went over this and talked about what that actually means. It does not mean philosophy in general. It does not mean Europe in general. It does not mean the West in general without constraints. It means all of these things in a specific sense, in a sense that issues from and has a genealogy in thinking and making sense of the world without reference to revelation, and to the extent that the ideas, wisdoms of that philosophy or that European science and wisdom issue from or agree with the wisdom of the revelation, that is perfectly fine, and that is something to embrace. So we are now, inshallah, beginning with the third foundation of this treatise, which is a comparison of the wisdom, the lessons that the Quran offers in relation to human beings' social life, and that of, again, Europe or the West, or let's call it again materialist philosophy. Bismillah. Third foundation. Hikmeti felsefe ile hikmeti Kur'aniyenin hayat-ı içtimaiye-i beşeriyeye verdiği terbiyeler. The lessons that the Quranic wisdom and the wisdom of philosophy each offer about the social life of human beings. Amma hikmeti felsefe ise hayat-ı içtimaiyede noktayı istinadı kuvvet kabul eder. Hedefi menfaat bilir. Düstur hayatı cidal tanır. Cemaatlerin rabıtasını unsuriyet, menfi milliyet tutar. Semeratı ise hevesat-ı nefsaniyeyi tatmin ve hacat-ı beşireyi tezyittir. As for the wisdom of philosophy, it accepts force as the point of reliance or reference in social life. Its target is interest. It recognizes struggle as the normative principle of life. It takes factionalism and negative nationalism as the bond that holds communities together. Its fruit is to gratify the lower soul's vain desires and to increase humanity's needs. So let's try to go over these one by one. As for the wisdom of philosophy, that is materialist philosophy, a philosophy that is devoid of, deprived from a higher entity, a higher and elevated, a lofty point of reference that could be the source of morality and law and lofty ideas and emotions and principles. A philosophy that is devoid of all of that, that reduces existence to matter. Matter without spirit, conscience, intellect, emotions, none of this, just matter, a continuous interaction of chemical substances, or at the more fundamental level, a continuous interaction of physicality. If that is reality, you live in a different world, in a world that is very different from the one that a believer lives in. Right? So this is the philosophy that originates from and built on that materialist conception of the world. As for the wisdom of philosophy, it accepts force as the point of reliance in social life. Now, why do we have to talk about this? Why do we have to think of philosophy as materialist philosophy? Well, that was the dominant form of philosophy, or dominant form of philosophical thinking at the time Ustad Nursi came of age in the late 19th century and witnessed transforming the world. In the Ottoman Empire, most intellectuals who graduated from the elite schools of the country graduated either as dedicated materialists who had made up their minds and decided to believe in this consciously, or perhaps as still religious people believing or thinking that they believed in God and religion, etc., but reducing religion to a small box in their lives and letting material considerations regulate the rest of their lives and society. Is it different in our time? Depends on where you look. There are people in the West, in the East, everywhere, that are in search of something higher and beyond and above, and that is spiritually satisfying, spiritually fulfilling. They were at the time too. They were not ruling. They were not the dominant force. So perhaps there may be more now. However, we are living in such an age that even spirituality can be subverted and co-opted in the name of the gratification of the vain desires of the lower soul. Call it consumerism, call it capitalism, call it whatever you call it. This is happening. So perhaps there are less people who are devoted to materialism, scientism, etc., at a philosophical level, but the materiality of the world that has started to dominate people's lives. Secularity, this escape from religion and lofty ideas, is even more widespread. So this is relevant, perhaps even more relevant, provided that we understand it in a way that indicates and highlights its relevance to our times. As for the wisdom of philosophy, it accepts force as the point of reliance in social life, or the point of reference in social life. What do we mean by force? It can be brute force, or it can be power exercised in more subtle ways. The point is, do we accept that whoever has power, whoever has the force, whoever is the winner, should take what's on the table and go? Or should we recognize higher laws, regulations, constraints that are going to limit our lives. One way to think about this might be in political science, in political thought, for instance, the introduction of constitutions and constitutional rights. Liberalism emerged from that. And that was an idea that was around at the time that Ustad Nursi was writing these things, but it was not necessarily defining how the world should function. Yes, liberalism was an idea that was promoted quite a bit in some European countries themselves, such as the United Kingdom, England. However, this was not applied to the rest of the world. It was seen as a luxury for a limited minority that was property, or that was citizens of a certain country, or that was members of a certain racial identification. It was not recognized as a human right. Now, what happened when it was later on recognized as a human life? Obviously, that was an important and good step that humanity took, right? However, because the moral foundation that should consolidate it in people's hearts was still missing and is still missing, people who have force still rule the field. We have many countries around the world. The majority of the countries around the world are ruled by despotic, authoritarian rulers. I'm not going to say leaders, because the word leader implies some level of respect and acceptance by the larger population. In many cases, they rule as agents of democratic regimes, but the word democracy is reduced to elections, and elections can be manipulated. I'm not talking about fraud. They can be manipulated. People's consent can be manufactured. People's agreement can be manipulated and produced. People's actions, decisions, opinions can be manipulated, and it is being done all the time through the control of information, through the allocation of resources. This is a problem that is afflicting humanity at a very large scale. At the time Ustad Nursi was writing this, it was imperialism. Imperialism and also local despotisms that ruled many countries around the world. So even if there were places where the Europeans had not yet colonized, the peoples of those small communities were not necessarily living as equal, dignified members of a society. There were differentiating hierarchies that took away from the dignity of individuals. The protection of dignity is one of the principles, one of the foundational principles of Islam. So, as for the wisdom of philosophy, it accepts force as the point of reliance or reference in social life. Again, why? Because if there is no morality, if there is no higher idea, higher being to constrain those who have more force from doing what they want to do, why should they be constrained? Right? What is going to constrain them? Yes, there are notions that one of the foundations of liberalism would be that if everybody treats everybody else well, everybody will be better and the society in general will be better, etc., etc. But still, there is nothing that's going to morally constrain those who find themselves in a position to abuse and exploit others in the society, other than their individual conscience, right? But if you are going to deny the existence of conscience, and if you are going to not attribute any function to it in organizing society, then what are we left with? Material interest, like an animal world. Like an animal world. When the lion goes to the prairie, it does not think about the morality of eating the deer. It's just hungry and goes and eats the deer. Right? It does not think about the morality of killing more than what it needs to eat. Now, lions don't do it. Lions don't kill more deer than they need to eat, right? But they don't do it out of a moral consideration. They do it out of economization of energy, right? They don't feel like they should exert more effort than it is necessary to fill their stomach. On the other hand, there are other animals that are going to go and just kill. So when we talk about animals, we leave morality behind. We talk in a world where there is no morality. When human beings are reduced to materiality, again, we are in a world where there is no morality left. Its target, the target of the wisdom of philosophy, is interest. And that for a very long time defined one of the sciences and ways of thinking that regulated our lives. It continues to do so, but there are some hiccups in that process. Now, economy. The foundational principle of the science of economy is that human beings are rational, and rationality is defined by an urge, an intellectually and informed process of decision making, the objective of which is maximizing interest or utility. Interest is the target. The problem is, if each and every individual thinks of maximizing interest, personal interest, as the target, regardless of consideration for others' interests, what happens? It used to be that, following on the dictum that one's rights start where another's end, or one's freedom starts where another's end, we try to impose some constraint on freedoms, the notion of boundless freedom, right? But that is more often than not implemented as one's or others' rights start where my interests end. And that's a very different conception of the world. I mean, think about the Nazis, who thought that they were the superhumans, and there were others in the world who were beneath them and not worth giving a second consideration when it came to taking their possessions and belongings away. And if they occupied a certain part of the world, it was the right of the superhumans to go and take it. Living space, they called this, right? They were the ones, the members of humanity that had the vigor, the superiority in life, and it was perfectly okay to go and get land or resources from others to expand their living space. The way animals do, again. There's a difference between interest and right. A big difference between interest and right. A right is defined, again, by reference to a higher reality, to morality, to the greater good. Interest is defined by individual satisfaction. Now, one might think further ahead and say that, well, my interest rests in the improvement of the society as a whole, improvement of humanity as a whole. If everybody is good, I'm going to be better, etc., etc. But we do not think of interest in the long term. We tend to think of it in the short term or medium term. If everybody thought of their interests in the long term, there would be no global warming, there would be no environmental crisis today, but there is. And humanity as a whole seems to be incapable of stepping back and doing the right things in order to stop it, because particular interests continue to define the way humanity as a whole, or social groups, communities, and states and governments move within the larger humanity. It recognizes struggle as the normative principle of life. Struggle. Survival of the fittest. And this can even be glorified. If you have 5 different species in the same space and one of them has better qualities, struggle will lead to the other 4 being eliminated, and the species that has the higher qualities and quote-unquote that deserves to be there in the expense of the others will survive and rule the place. So struggle then might be considered a good thing. Of course, if you think of this from that materialist point of view. Struggle is a process that eliminates the weak and highlights the strong and leaves the strong to live on, so that existence overall can have a higher quality. The problem, of course, is first, we do not know which of those 5 species is fulfilling what function for the good, for the greater good of the space itself. Everything in the creation is created with a wisdom. There's a wisdom in the creation of everything. It serves a function in the larger reality, in the big picture. Call it ecology, right? Or, call it providence. Call it divine wisdom. It doesn't matter. The phenomenon that we are referring to is the same thing. Everything is created for a wisdom, with a wisdom, and serves a function in existence, and everything needs everything. Everything is connected to one another. Struggle that will lead to the elimination of certain things then detracts from the whole. Even if you don't refer to a higher reality and morality that has its foundations in the ordainments of that higher reality, this notion of struggle is absurd. The survival of the fittest is absurd. But again, when you leave everything to materiality, it is lower souls and the vain desires of the lower soul that rule, and therefore, because it is incapable of taking long-term interest seriously, it will recognize struggle as the normative principle. If I don't do it, others will do it. Therefore, I should do it. If I don't steal the money from this bank, somebody else is going to come and steal. That is how the system runs. The whole thing is corrupt. Let's say if I don't give bribes to this official and take this thing, somebody else will come and bribe him and take it. Therefore, let me do it. That's how most societies function now. And I'm not talking about the West, the East, etc., etc. That's how most societies where transparency is lacking function now, and that is almost all Muslim countries. The problem here is that wisdom of philosophy entered the thoughts, the behaviors, the philosophies of even Muslims and other non-Western, non-Christian, non-originally non-European nations, peoples, communities. It became the norm. It's even more dangerous. It takes factionalism and negative nationalism as the bond that holds communities together. And again, think about Ustad Nursi writing these things in the early 20th century, after World War I and before World War II. What a time period. Empires disintegrated as a result of nationalisms, and in order to sort out the national borders, those nations that emerged out of empires fought bitter, bloody fights. And they have been continuing to fight ever since, but it was even more intense at that time. communities of different beliefs, different ethnicities, different colors and races, etc., that defined multi-ethnic, multi-confessional empires, such as the Habsburg Empire, such as Russia, such as the Ottoman Empire. They came apart. They came apart partly because their economies were failing, partly because their rulers made wrong decisions, partly because geopolitics played a role, partly because England or Great Britain became too strong, incomparably stronger than others as a result of the industries, etc., that it developed, but also partly because this thing called factionalism and what Ustad Nursi calls negative nationalism eat them up from inside. Negative nationalism is thinking that others are lower, inferior, in order to bond your own tribe, your own group, your own nation together. If you are routing for team A and there is a team B with which you have a long-lasting rivalry, let's say in soccer, the nationalism of team A is going to be defined as the slogan, team B sucks. Team B is inferior. The more you insult team B, the more you put a negative light on team B, the more, for some reason, the lower souls of those who identify with the team A come together and think of themselves as members of a group. Xenophobia is an important product of this. Think about the anti-refugee sentiments in many parts of the world that are on the rise today. It is the strongest where you have the least number of migrants, but where also you have authoritarian regimes that try to manufacture consent for their misgovernment. Hungary has probably less than 100 migrants. Germany has received probably close to 1 million migrants in their past years. The level of anti-migrant sentiments in Hungary is 100 times more than the level of anti-migrant sentiments in Germany. This is a construct. This is being produced. This is being produced in order to achieve certain ends in the society, in order to induce certain forms of behavior in society. Negative nationalism, negative patriotism, negative factionalism, negative devotion to religion. These are worms that eat us up from inside as societies. These divide us up. These lead to violence. These lead to struggle, unnecessary struggle, imaginary struggle that does not serve the purpose of furthering the interests of various groups of people, various communities, but rather serves the function of furthering the interests of particular individuals, particular ruling elites within each society. We need to think seriously about these issues. These are not jokes. These are things that cause us our lives, livelihoods, comfort, happiness, and in some cases, otherworldly salvation in the hereafter. Because while fighting for the greater interest of the nation, greater interest of this or that, and sometimes religion can be turned into a form of nationalism. While fighting for that, people eschew moral values. People eschew values and constraints that God has ordained. People eschew the Sharia. People eschew the commands of God in the name of religion, and sometimes in the name of Islam. Isn't that how we ended up with things like Daesh, ISIS, whatever you are going to call it, Al-Qaeda, terrorism in the name of Islam? How can that even be a concept? How can there be terrorism in the name of Islam? Islam is a religion with reference to God as the source of higher morality, and that God is merciful. How can you reconcile God's mercy with acts of terrorism? But people do it. Why? Out of negative nationalism. Because they turn Islam into some kind of a nation. And their Islam becomes reduced to Islamism, nationalism of religion. Right? That has its source not in the Quran. It has its source in that materialist philosophy that defined the world sometime in the late 19th century on. We need to be careful about the genealogies of our ideas and ideologies, and the sentiments that those ideas and ideologies produce, and the actions that they induce. Its fruit is to gratify the lower soul's vain desires and to increase humanity's needs. This is the root of it. This is the fruit of it, and this is the root of it too. At the end of the day, right, the search for force, the search for the maximization of interest, the struggle and factionalism and negative nationalism and all that they bring at the individual level, that is the building blocks of society, right? Are all geared towards, or are all locked to the objective target of gratifying the lower soul's vain desires, seeing that you are superior to those, being able to go and get what they have to use yourself. The notion of the desire to exploit others, the desire to lie back and have others work for you, the desire to benefit from the labor of others, to exploit the labor of others, live from the labor of others. The problem is, this is already a problem, but another problem is that lower soul will never be satisfied. The more you try to satisfy or gratify the lower soul's vain desires, the more it will want. Therefore, the more it is gratified, the more the humanity's needs increase. As individuals exploit the labor of others and accumulate vast amounts of wealth, they have to sit down and think about what they are going to do with that wealth. And what you do with that wealth, well, is limited. In the given world that we live in, you will start to push boundaries. Let me do that too, let me do that too, let me do that too. This is not satisfying me any longer. It is like the adrenaline buildup. You do something that is exciting and releases adrenaline in your body, but after a point, the threshold of your adrenaline tolerance increases, and what you were doing does not satisfy you any longer. You have to do something even more adrenaline producing, even more dangerous, even more exciting. And then the same thing happens. The threshold keeps increasing and increasing and increasing. There was a time when people were now we're going back to the gratification of the lower soul. There was a time when people were happy to live, sleep in houses that had a roof. If you had a roof on top of yourself, that was perfect. You did not need mattresses. And I have seen people who think of a mattress as a strange thing. They an unnecessary, it's a comfort. They'll have one perhaps mattress in the house that is going to be spared for guests, or that's going to be spared for perhaps there's an elder person in the house, but all the rest are going to just, lie down some corner of the house, perhaps on a carpet, fold a jacket under their head. This is the way that they normally live, and this used to be the norm for most human beings in most societies. But now the threshold has risen, including myself. Most of the people I suppose who are listening to this would not be able to sleep on the hard floor. Part of it is because we got so used to our bodies adjust, and our bodies are not able to tolerate the hard floor. If you were to sleep on hard floor perhaps for 2 years, perhaps our bodies could adjust back to the hard floor, and that could become comfortable for us too. But the fact is that we are now used to mattresses. There was a time when if you lived far away from your loved ones, if somebody went that way once in a blue moon, once in, let's say, 5 years, you would send some news, perhaps some gifts, and that would be that would be worth the worlds for them. Or if they sent something to you, that would be worth the worlds for you. There was a time later on when postal services became a part of our lives. We started to write letters and postcards and whatnot to each other, perhaps send some gifts to each other. Right? You send a letter, and if you receive the response to that letter, let's say after 6 months, depending on where you lived and how far the distance was, you would be happy. There was a time when, fast forward a bit more, when people started to be able to send telegraphs, right? You sent some news to your loved ones. There was a baby that was born, and then you received the congratulations for the baby through a telegraph. Right? It was okay, and it was perfectly fine, and it was actually quite happy, felicitous to receive news from your loved ones within a time span of, let's say, 2 months. You would sit down and spend time writing those letters and putting your thoughts and emotions with your handwriting on paper and send it, and this was a blissful thing to do. Now that we have internet, we invented the email, we invented social media, WhatsApp, Snapchat, whatever. You write to a friend and ask a question, and if you don't receive a response within, let's say, 2 hours, you feel indignant. The time span, the expiration date of a response is shortened so much that it would have been absurd from the point of view of a person who lived 100 years ago. I'm not saying that this is bad. There are many good things that come out of this. What I'm saying is the more our desires, the desires of our lower souls are gratified, the more they want. The more the definition of the normal includes gratifications of the lower soul. And the more that happens, the more our lower souls start to rule us, as opposed to us ruling over our lower souls. And again, this is something that we need to be careful about. We don't want our lower souls to rule us. We want to be able to rule our lower souls. We want to give the bridles of our existence to our hearts and intellects, not to our lower souls. But that's what's happening. Halbuki kuvvetin şe'ni tecavüzdür. Menfaatin şe'ni her arzuya kafi gelmediğinden üstünde boğuşmaktır. Düstur-u cidalin şe'ni çarpışmaktır. Unsuriyetin şe'ni başkasını yutmakla beslenmek olduğundan tecavüzdür. İşte bu hikmettendir ki beşerin saadeti selb olmuştur. And thus, the characteristic of force is aggression. The characteristic of force is aggression. It is in its nature. It is its characteristic. One who has force uses it. Maybe can have some restraint for a while, but the restraint of one who has force will always be less than the restraint of one who does not have force, unless that restraint is checked to the presence of a higher force, a higher entity. Imagine it. Imagine it. Think of a 150-pound man with a 200-pound man. They are walking in the street, perhaps on a dark night, and they, scrape shoulders. And who is more likely to be apologetic? Of course, there will be people who will be 250 pounds and will be apologetic and humble and so on and so forth. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about our conceptions of what the average behavior is likely to be. Right? The characteristic of force is aggression. If you have an A-bomb, you speak with a louder voice. If you have an A-bomb, you have a seat in the Security Council. You have a permanent seat in the Security Council and of the United Nations, and a veto power. If you don't, if you are a small country with 5 million people with a GDP that is 1,000th of the GDP of one of those stronger countries, you don't have that. Maybe you have a vote, yeah, but you don't have much of the other powers. You don't have powers in the executive branches of the community of nations. That's how it works. That is how things somehow settle when all pieces fall to their places. Since there isn't enough to fulfill every desire, the characteristic of interest is fighting over it. The way Marx defined communism was that there would be so much abundance in that communist stage, that in that communist stage in history, that people would not need to allocate resources. It is like air. If you are living, imagine yourself living in a prairie where the air is clean, etc., etc. Before these environmental crises, did anybody think of allocating air? You breathe 2 times more than I did today, so you have to breathe 2 times less than me tomorrow. No, air is so much that nobody thinks of allocating it. Sunlight, does anybody think of allocating sunlight? Unless we are thinking about solar energy and the fields where you can put those solar panels, etc. That's not what I'm talking about. On a bright day, as you are walking in the street, do you have fights with your neighbors over them using more of the sunlight? No, doesn't happen. Doesn't happen. But these are exceptional. There are so very few things that are so abundant that we do not need to allocate. Most things we need to allocate. Now, the allocation can be fair, or the allocation can be fought over. Since there isn't enough to fulfill every desire, right? The characteristic of interest. So if interest and not right is the standard that we are going to use in allocating resources, then people will have to fight over it. The characteristic of the principle of struggle is conflict. That should be clear, because if I struggle and you struggle, we struggle against each other and we have conflict. Because it is based on nourishing oneself by swallowing others, the characteristic of factionalism is aggression. Because it is based on nourishing oneself by swallowing others. Now, there are win-win situations and we want to think about them and have them. But they are few, and even in win-win situations, if the decision-making process is left to the lower soul, because it will never be satisfied, it will want to win more than the other. It will not consent to 50-50. It will want 55-45. Even if 50 is more than what it needs, the very desire to own, sometimes meaningless desire to own, to possess, sometimes we have things, the function of it, which is nothing beyond possession. We have things to possess, right? That is the characteristic of the lower soul. It wants to have more. It wants to enjoy more. It wants more, right? Because this is the case, because it is based on nourishing oneself by swallowing others, the characteristic of factionalism. Factionalism is what the lower soul does for the individual. Factionalism does it for society or for communities. The characteristic of factionalism is aggression. It needs to nourish itself by swallowing others. It wants to have more than others. It wants to have what others have, and if there is enough to share, or if it is a win-win situation, it wants to have more than the others. So it is because of this wisdom that the humanity has lost felicity. Again, this is after World War I, before World War II. That horrible time period in human history, which is leading from one horrible thing to another horrible thing. May God protect us from the likes of those, but frankly, we are not living through very good times either. Amma. So what about the Quran? What about what the Quran tells us is as an alternative? Amma hikmet-i Kur'aniye ise noktayı istinadı kuvvete bedel hakkı kabul eder. Gayede menfaate bedel fazilet ve rızayı ilahiyi kabul eder. Hayatta düsturu cidal yerine düsturu teavüne esas tutar. Cemaatlerin rabıtalarında unsuriyet milliyet yerine rabıta-i dini ve sınıfi ve vatani kabul eder. Gayatı nevesat-ı nefsaniyenin tecavüzatına set çekip ruhu maaliyata teşvik ve hissiyat-ı ulviyesini tatmin eder ve insanı kemalat-ı insaniyeye sevk edip insan eder. As for the Quranic wisdom, it accepts rights to be its point of reliance or reference, as opposed to force. As purpose, it accepts virtue and divine pleasure, as opposed to interest. It takes the principle of mutual assistance as opposed to the principle of struggle as the foundation of life. In bonding communities together, instead of factionalism and nationality, it accepts bonds of religion, class, and country. Its purposes limit the transgression of the vain desires of the lower soul, encourage the spirit toward noble ideals, satisfy its lofty emotions, and directs human beings toward the perfections of humanity. As for the Quranic wisdom, it accepts rights to be its point of reliance as opposed to force. I have the force to take the apple that you have in your hand, but I know that it is your right, and I'm going to restrain myself from taking it from you because, again, I know that it is your right. That is defined by a higher reality that is beyond myself. It may be our shared belief in a better world when we agree together and think about our long-term interests. It may be my willingness to sacrifice my short-term interests for the perceived long-term interests, or even better, it may be belief in a higher reality. That apple belongs to you. If I take it from you by force, that is robbery, and I'm going to account for it before God on the day of judgment, and I fear his punishment. I prefer to be deprived from the apple today to being deprived of his mercy in the hereafter. Rights as opposed to force. As purpose, so what do we want to achieve? It accepts virtue and divine pleasure as opposed to interest. Yes, it is to my interest to take the apple and eat because I am hungry. But I want virtue instead. I want God's pleasure because I know that it is much worthier. It is much more valuable than the satisfaction and satiation that the apple is going to give to me. Notice how reference to a higher entity is fixing things. It takes the principle of mutual assistance as opposed to the principle of struggle as the foundation of life. Mutual assistance. Think of this. Think of what the Ansar and the Muhajirun did when the believers of Mecca moved to Medina. Ansar were the helpers. Ansar were the residents of Medina who had accepted Islam, and Muhajirin were the migrants from Mecca. The Prophet ﷺ matched them as brothers. Each member of the community of migrants was matched by a member of the community of helpers, and they became brothers. They shared their houses. The helpers invited the migrants to their houses and shared their houses. They gave them property. They undertook their livelihood. Why? Did any of the Ansar have any interest in dividing their house into half and giving one half to one of the migrants if the only point of reference was interest and the material world, etc., etc., no reference to no higher entity or thought or ideal? No. But they knew that if they shared that house with their believing brother today, God would give to them palaces in paradise. After one of the expeditions, when the Muslim community acquired a lot of booty, the Prophet ﷺ asked the helpers, asked the Ansar, would you like me to give this booty to the migrants, distribute it among the migrants, and release you from the duty of taking care of your migrant believing brothers? Or would you like to continue to take care of them and I'm going to distribute this equally among everybody? They said, oh Prophet ﷺ, distribute the booty among the migrants and don't take the responsibility of taking care of them from our shoulders. We are happy with our brothers. We want to continue to take care of them. What makes them do this? What is the foundation of this mutual assistance? Yes, the recognition that we are all together on this boat. But if I think that I'm going to die before the boat reaches the final destination, and while I'm on this boat, I can make a better life for myself. I can make life better for myself by exploiting others. Will I continue to behave in a mood of assistance? Or will I say, if I'm vile and I'm only thinking about my material interests, or will I say, well, the boat has a long way to go and I can either be a master or a slave on this boat, and I will choose to be a master. Where is a community of masters and slaves, and where is a community of brothers? We want a community of brothers, and the way to achieve that is to not leave things to the lower soul, but to refer to them, each individual's relationship to and accountability before and hopes in a higher reality, God. In bonding communities together, instead of factionalism and nationality, it accepts bonds of religion, class, and country. Now, bonds of religion, class, and country can also turn into sources of conflict. But the trick here is religion, class, and country are real. They are not imagined. They are real. And they do entail certain interests and rights and bonds. If those bonds are used to construct others in a negative image, they are not bonds of religion, class, and country anymore. They are bonds of factionalism. So I am Muslim and I love my Muslim brothers. I'm going to have a community with them. I'm going to go to the mosque with them. I'm going to break fast with them. I'm going to do business with them. I work in the same factory with that young man when he finds himself in a state of difficulty, when he needs a little bit of financial assistance. I'm going to loan him some money. And I'm not going to ask for it back until it is time for him to be able to give it back. And if I need, I'm going to expect my fellow workers in this factory to do the same for me. I am from the same village for that person. We share genealogies, we share certain images, memories, we share a certain space together, right? There is something that binds us together, that bonds us together. I'm going to have company with him. I'm going to seek his company, and I'm going to offer my assistance to him. However, this does not mean that I'm going to become enemies to the member of that other village if and when the member of my village has a conflict with the member of that other village without asking any questions just because he is my fellow village man. No. Rights, right? It accepts rights to be its point of reliance as opposed to force. It accepts virtue and divine pleasure as opposed to interest. It is not the interest of my fellow villager or my interest in seeing my fellow villager to be elevated above others. No, it is divine pleasure. It is rights. I'm going to look at who has the right and who doesn't. I'm not going to go into factionalism about this. I'm not going to say, well, if he is my man, I'm going to back him. No questions asked. No, that's not it. We are not going to fall into some kind of relativism and reduce people to lonely individuals by depriving them of all sorts of communal bonds. We will recognize bonds. We are social human beings. We are social beings. We need community. We need companionship. We need the presence of other souls in our lives. But this does not mean that we are going to turn that companionship into factionalism, into struggle with other companies, other communities. We will be here as communities in order to engage one another, know one another, help one another. We are not going to be here in order to fight with one another, in order to struggle with one another. Its purposes limit the transgressions of the vain desires. And again, this is the foundation of all. One who conquers his lower desires, his lower soul, can do anything. Can do anything that is within the capacity of human beings. Its purposes limit the transgressions of the vain desires of the lower soul, encourage the spirit toward noble ideals, satisfy its lofty emotions. Satisfy its lofty emotions. Yes, there is a satisfaction in taking the apple from your hand and eating it. But there is also a satisfaction in seeing that it is your apple and you should eat it, and seeing you eat your apple. In making sure that my poor fellow village man is lifted up from poverty through my assistance, even though that means that I am going to content myself with a little less than what I could have otherwise have. Its purposes limit the transgressions of the vain desires of the lower soul, encourage the spirit toward noble ideals. It makes people idealists, not materialists, not utilitarian individuals, not seekers of interest, but seekers of lofty emotions, noble ideals, and directs human beings toward the perfections of humanity. Perfections of humanity. They become seekers of perfection. And seekers of perfection can live with one another, because perfection lies not in the aggrandizement of the self, not in the aggregation of possessions. It lies in being good citizens of the communities that we live in, being helpful and kind, and being good to one another, doing good to one another. Hakkın şe'ni ittifaktır. Faziletin şe'ni tesanüttür. Düsturu teavünün şe'ni birbirinin imdadına yetişmektir. Dinin şe'ni uhuvvettir, incizaptır. nefsi gemlemekle bağlamak, ruhu kemalata kamçılamakla serbest bırakmanın şe'ni saadeti dareyndir. The characteristic of rights is alliance, agreement, working together. Once we recognize a structure in which we are all entitled to basic rights that will be satisfactory for our existence and dignity, and once we abide by the requirements of that structure, recognizing rights of one another, then we can agree. We don't need to quarrel. We don't need to struggle for something. We can work together towards something better. But if we recognize force as the foundation of our society, then, I'm stronger than you, I'll take it from you. And then one day there will be somebody who is stronger than me, and he'll take it from me. While I'm taking it from you, you will try to find ways, means to become more powerful. And then one day when you are stronger than me, I got old, I lost my means, you are now stronger than me, you'll take it from me. No, that's not what we want. We want rights that are going to be permanent and designed and defined and put in place and protected in reference to higher realities, higher ideals. And the highest ideal, highest source of ideas and ideals, God. Who knows humanity? Who knows creation better than him? Who can ordain rules for the organization of humanity, society, and the creation better than him? One who knows can organize better. The characteristic of virtue is mutual alliance. The characteristic of the principle of mutual assistance is hastening to help one another in time of need. The characteristic of religion is solidarity and mutual attraction, right? We want solidarity. We have solidarity among believers. Believers are mutually attracted to one another. But this does not mean, once again, that their attraction to one another translates into their repulsion from others or their aggression toward others. The characteristic of reining in and tethering the lower soul and urging and releasing the spirit free is felicity in both worlds. In this world, this is a happy state of being because we are living in the community of happy people who are safe and peaceful and look forward to a peaceful future, expect that their fellow men and women will do good for them, will avoid doing harm to them, even if that could in the short term mean for them to increase their interest, maximize their interest. The characteristic of virtue is we will be living in a society where we are mutually allied with one another. The characteristic of the principle of mutual assistance is hastening to help one another. If you are in need, I'm going to come to your help. If I'm in need, I'm going to expect you to come to my help. And I know that I will not be frustrated. I will not be disappointed. The characteristic of religion is solidarity and attraction. The characteristic of reining in and tethering the lower soul and urging and releasing the spirit free to fly toward higher ideals. It's happiness in this world and it is happiness in the hereafter, because this is the wisdom that the Quran offers. The Quran is God's eternal speech, and if you follow the wisdom of the eternal speech, it takes you to eternity. It takes you to felicity in eternity. All right, inshallah, we will try to finish the 12th word in the next episode by going over the fourth foundation, which will be about the comparison of the Quran with other forms of divine speech and other forms of speech in general, to establish its superiority, to establish its loftiness. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم وآخر الدعواهم أن الحمد لله رب العالمين. الفاتحة.